Whenever there's an overfocus on something, that necessarily means there is something left out. In the Mao era, this means the atrocities. On the one hand, this would be always related also to the bilateral relations between China and Japan.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Transformative Podcast. I'm Jannis Panagiotidis, Scientific Director of RECET, and I'm very happy to welcome today Markéta Bajgerová Verly, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences and a political scientist specializing in memory politics with a particular focus on China. So, hello, Markéta.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Today we're going to talk about your research related to the memory of the Second World War in China. I want to introduce this topic by referring to a recent incident when the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, caused a minor diplomatic incident when she expressed surprise in an interview that at an ASEAN meeting, Russia addressed China as a fellow victor of World War II. I found this incident quite remarkable in two ways. I think, first of all, because it shows in general how politicized the memory of World War II is, especially in 2025, which marked the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. But it also showed how little known the Asian theater of World War II remains in Europe. You've done research on the changing narratives of World War II in China and how they are intertwined with political developments and the legitimization of communist rule. Before we get exactly to these narratives and their meaning and functions, I think it would be helpful for our listeners to get some historical background, first of all, on World War II in China. So, in short, what happened there?
Well, it's very difficult to give a short version. I will attempt it. So rather than thinking of World War II as one linear event that has a very clear designated starting point and very clear designated final point, we have to understand that what World War II really was, was a sequence of increasingly interconnected conflicts that were bridging different national borders and different continents. But World War II is also a narrative frame. There were parts of the world that were not actively involved in the conflict. So maybe that's already a political outline of how we discuss that history. When it comes to China and its experience during this series of conflicts, whenever I start teaching a class on that, I go back to the Opium Wars in the 19th century, because that is really the time in which development in East Asia start to unravel in a rather accelerated and dramatic and prominent way, and not just for China but also for Japan. In China itself, in the latter half of the 19th century, this is when the millennium-long imperial system comes crashing down. The last Qing dynasty is engaged in several wars with colonial powers, starting with the Opium Wars, and they lose quite substantially in these different wars. It comes also the first engagement with Japan, with the first Sino-Japanese War at the end of the century. Then there is the Russo-Japanese War that is actually fought on Chinese territory between these two different imperial powers in the region. And throughout that, Qing dynasty and the imperial system crashes at the beginning of the 20th century. And with that also a big turmoil happens in China. The new discussions over how should a modern nation, how should new China look like, starts to come about. With that, we have the main outcomes of that are these two versions of New China represented by the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party. And subsequently, among this violent turmoil within China, this is also the time in which it's referred to as the warlord time, in which the Chinese territory is fragmented into different areas controlled by different military leaders. the nationalist forces that unify China, but then engage in civil war with the Communist Party. This is the context within which Japanese invasion comes in. First, Japanese presence starts in 1931 in September 1931 happens the so-called Mukden incident, which is the beginning of the colonization of Manchuria. That is the northeastern part of China. And in 1937, then comes the full-scale invasion by Japan. What is very often, I think, forgotten also in the World War II discourse is that the wars have started earlier in East Asia. What happens in China in 1936, few months before the full-scale invasion happens, is something quite interesting. The two forces that are engaged in a civil war, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and the communists led by Mao Zedong, they join forces, they put their civil war on hold and decide that it's time to face off the more prominent threat of Japanese imperial army. And a few months after that, Japan invades. We see the Battle of Shanghai raging for a couple of months, mostly led by the nationalist forces. The division of the forces was that the nationalist forces would lead the full front, the classic frontal warfare, whereas the communists would very often lead the guerrilla warfare, attacking from the rear, sabotages against the Japanese. The Japanese then continue occupying the Chinese territory. In a couple of weeks, they reach Nanjing. That's at that time the Chinese capital city, and the period of the several weeks of the winter between 1937 and 1938 is a period of mass atrocities perpetrated by the Japanese army against the civilians. At that point, the nationalist command relocates to Chongqing. In 1941, there is this simultaneous attack on, at that point, British Malaya, and a simultaneous attack on the Pearl Harbor base. This is, of course, relevant because now this is what is generally understood as the opening of the East Asian theater of World War II on a more standard narrative. China is, in the meanwhile, suffering heavy losses. At that point, however, it is important to bear in mind that China becomes one of the Allied powers. China is in negotiation with the US, with the British representatives. They are a party to the Cairo Conference in 1943. China does take part in some of the engagements in Burma, and there are allied forces, specifically from the Air Force, that are present in China. Finally, we get to the most known development in East Asia, which is the atomic bombardment of Japan. And in between two bombs being dropped, the Soviet Union joins in and declares a war against Japan, which are all these developments that then contribute to the capitulation of Japan. But we, of course, cannot understand the experience and the way this history is politicized from the Chinese context if we do not also add a little side note that, just like in a lot of other places around the world, the end of World War II does not mean end of hostilities or violence. China plunges into the full-scale civil war, which then reaches its end in 1949 with the establishment of the People's Republic of China and the nationalist retreat to Taiwan.
Thank you for this concise introduction into a complicated war theater that I think is very important that we hear something more about, precisely because China is a bit of a forgotten ally. I want to take up where you left off in the end. So the civil war after the end of the Second World War and the victory of the communists. So essentially, communist rule over China, which lasts to this very day, was an outcome of World War II and subsequent events, making this, of course, an important part of the foundational myth of communist rule. Please tell us a bit about how the Communist Party represents this history in its historical narrative of its rule and of Chinese history since those times.
In China, this conflict is most commonly referred to as either war of resistance against Japan or as anti-Japanese war. That would be the direct translation of Gangerjangjang, which is anti-Japanese war. It is taken as one of these historical examples that would justify the communist parties' claim on the rule over this new China. In the Mao era, and the leadership, even though it's one communist party, one party system that has been since 1949 in China, that doesn't mean it's the same thing. It's the leadership and the direction, the agenda, the imaginings of Chinese nation have shifted throughout. And for me, as someone who's researching memory politics in China, it's really fascinating to kind of trace back how these different changes in the leadership and these visions impacted the framing of the war. So to start with the Mao era, at that time, this conflict was painted as a communist triumph. And here the emphasis was not on just Chinese triumph over the Japanese invasion, but on the communist contribution to that. It's part of this heroic Mao-led epic recount of these guerrilla engagements, of these successful sabotages, resistance, anti-Japanese resistance groups. Whenever there's an overfocus on something, that necessarily means there is something left out. In the Mao era, this means the atrocities. On the one hand, this would be always related also to the bilateral relations between China and Japan. So there was a tendency to favor clemency for Japan, primarily, let's say in the 50s, 60s, for the reason that People's Republic of China was trying to establish itself in the international community. It is only in 1971 that it's People's Republic of China that begins to represent China at the platform of the United Nations. So the atrocities are not actively remembered to also bridge relations, political, diplomatic, and economic between China and Japan. Focus on the atrocities is not necessarily favoring the narrative of communist forces protecting China, saving it, guaranteeing its survival. If atrocities would be brought to forth and the suffering would be given central stage, it would kind of unsettle such claims. And thirdly, the atrocities were not necessarily in line with the victorious and the triumphant tone overall. Things change as China did significantly in the 1980s. So in the aftermath of the turbulent period that has seen first the Great Leap Forward, followed by the Cultural Revolution, one of the most violent periods in modern Chinese history. This period in the 1980s kind of led through with the figure of Deng Xiaoping, as commonly referred to as the Reform and Open Up. A lot of things have been changing in China. And one of these things have been also the ways in which World War II or the conflict, this part of conflict would be narrated. On the one hand, there is a much more opening of freedom of research. So the maintenance of what is possible to research are broadened. And for that, also the historians, the scholars in China start diving deeper, let's say, into cases like Nanjing. Regional historians are given more freedom to do this research. So on one hand, this is an element that drives the introduction of the atrocities into the prominent discourse. But the higher level is also important here, with the diplomatic relations between China and Japan getting into a rift, especially around the 1982 textbook controversy. The textbook controversy is one of the series of textbook controversies in the Sino-Japanese relations. And in 1982, this started with a change of framing in one of the Japanese textbooks. Instead of saying Japan invaded, it would be changed to Japan advanced into. From the People's Republic of China, this was taken as deeply problematic. Therefore, this was another push to drive a more active remembrance of the atrocities. It's in this period, in the 1980s, that the victimhood frame enters Chinese memory politics regarding World War II. It's also at that time in which the major museums and memorial museums devoted to the remembrance of these atrocities come about. In the 90s, following up the brutal crackdown on the protests, mostly in 1989, mostly associated with the Tiananmen Square. And once again, we get back to the legitimacy of Chinese Communist Party. It is in the 90s that the Chinese Communist Party launches this patriotic education campaign that is intended to remedy this ideological crisis that they saw, particularly relating to the young generation as being disillusioned with the ideology of communism and the communist triumphant rhetoric not really kind of hitting the mark. Around this time that the victimhood trope really gains traction and is intended to unify the fragmented and disillusioned society. So the victimhood narratives, not just in China, overall, they tend to have this unifying function and with directing attention away from the failures and the violence committed by the Communist Party itself to violence that was committed by a foreign other, by the outsider.
In the present situation, it seems that the relationship of China with Russia is becoming more and more important, in particular since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the position that China takes towards this as Russia is becoming more isolated towards the West and therefore arguably turns a lot more towards China than before. And of course, we know that Russian, Chinese and Soviet Chinese relations have not always been quite as easy either. So this is not so much of a natural alliance, perhaps, as it's emerging now. Tell us a bit what role this narrative of World War II, in particular perhaps with a view to this relationship with Russia, which Ms. Callas was so surprised about, how this plays out in the present memory discourse.
As everything in China since Xi Jinping's rule, the memory regarding World War II also once again transformed. So we kind of, where we left off was this prominent coexistence of victory and victimhood discourse with a more prominent victimhood focus. And this is particularly, I think, in the early 2000s, you see it by the different changes that are done to the museums, that the atrocities are really kind of taking a very central stage, and the victimhood narrative does as well. However, on the one hand, it was also sort of in line with China's foreign policy at the time. This changes significantly when Xi Jinping comes to power. And as per similarly to 2025, every big anniversary is a good indicator of the direction in which the memory politics is going. So for Xi Jinping, the first one would be the 70th anniversary in 2015. And that is the time in which, once again, the atrocities are taking a sort of a backstage, and what comes through is prominent triumphant narrative. And not just domestic triumph, as in it's not only that China has saved itself from perishing, it has a global element. Since really the 70th anniversary now is the time in which China prominently includes and lobbies for the incorporation of its status as an ally, more broadly as the implications of being in one of the members of the allied clubs on an international stage nowadays. I usually just refer to it as the international. You see a big internationalization of this World War II narrative in China, in the framings and the way there's a tendency to really maximize the fact that China at the end was one of the victors. This is something that is seen as a broader strategy or on the agenda of Xi Jinping's foreign policy. So this is, once again, World War II is now a vehicle to drive this international aspect home as well. We see it also on the platform of the UN, and we see it across the spectrum of the mnemonic activities. One of the ways to do that is also by maximizing and really inflating this contribution. One way to do that, and this is maybe a great example of how memory politics functions, is that in 2017, the Ministry of Education in China has changed the timeline the official timeline of World War II, and here I use almost quotation marks, from 1937, which was the previously agreed time of a full-scale invasion to rolling back the clock and regarding 1931, the colonization of Manchuria, as the beginning of the conflict. So on the one hand, it allows for this argument that China has been fighting the evils of global fascism for the longest from the Allied club. And it allows also for an argument that by the time its main contemporary rival, the United States, was attacked in 1941, China was single-handedly fighting the aggression for 10 years already. So all these discursive tools can be very well instrumentalized for current geopolitical interests. And it is in this context that we can start to understand the alliance between contemporary Russia and China. With this stepped up cooperation, we really saw that at the military parade in Beijing in September 2025 for the occasion of the end of World War II, in which, of course, Vladimir Putin was prominently at the front row of this parade. This was an important message to the international community that the global world order is rescaling. In this regard, we see the bridging of Great Patriotic War and the War of Resistance against Japan as the main theaters, let's say, of the global war against fascism. This is also kind of the framing that it has, really being instrumentalized there. And this also follows through the discourses, through the museums, in which I would expect now to see much more emphasis on this cooperation. As you have mentioned, this was not always the case. So it really just shows how different parts of history are being deflated, inflated, as the current political needs suggest.
Markéta, thank you very much for being with us today, and hear you all at the next episode of the Transformative Podcast.